I want to welcome you all out to week three's live lecture. Today we're going to be discussing death, law, and identity in the sensation novel. Okay, last week we looked at the sensation novel in terms of issues related to schemes in which the dead were somehow capitalized on for monetary gain. If you recall this story of the Resurrection Man depicted here from the Mysteries of London, and how the Resurrection Man replaced a Mrs. Chesney's body with a corpse so that he and Mrs. Chesney and her son could claim an inheritance. So it was some scheme involving quote unquote resurrection in the sense that we thought it was dead, Mrs. Chesney, but it actually is not dead. It's still walking around collecting money. The idea of resurrection in this particular way plays on several anxieties pervasive in the mid-19th century with regard to the status of the corpse. As I mentioned last week, the research of Luigi Galvani inspired a lot of fictional accounts of reanimating corpses, as is obvious with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The galvanic experiments of the previous decades prior to the rise of sensation fiction informed attitudes in which the dead body was simply a not yet fully animated corpse. It was a person whose status was still liable to change somehow. One whose status was amenable to alteration based on whether or not one could kind of jumpstart its cerebrum with sufficient voltage. So what used to be, prior to Galvani, what used to be considered kind of a permanently dormant or dead or terminal state now has new possibilities to be reanimated, come back to life, be resurrected in this sense. And so the Victorians for many years kind of took this concept and ran with it in a lot of very imaginative ways in their fiction. Another relevant fixation in the 19th century mind with regard to death added to this sense in which the status of death was vague, or the border between life and death was seen as not quite a certainty. Since there were fewer instruments in those days to detect heart rates or brain activity, there were numerous accounts of people being prematurely buried, people who might just be in a coma, and this was extremely common in the middle of the century. Maybe whether or not it was actually happening is we're not able to determine at this stage, but certainly accounts of it or urban legends surrounding the idea of premature burial were quite common and popular in popular fiction. And there was a cholera outbreak in the middle of the century, which some people claim led to the urban legend that these people were being prematurely buried, people who might have symptoms of death, even though they might still be alive. Such concerns gave rise to Poe's story, The Premature Burial, in 1844. Such was the kind of craze related to the idea that one needed to avoid being buried prematurely. It led to these kinds of innovations that we see, devices that were actually built like a coffin that had a little flag attached to it, where if a body was buried alive, the buried body could, send a signal upstairs to tell everyone, hey, you guys, I'm still alive down here, please dig me up ASAP. Now, of course, in the novels that we're looking at today specifically, whether we're talking about Woman in White or Lady Audley's Secret, they don't deal with actual cases of being buried alive. However, I would argue that this idea that there is this vague boundary between the corpse and the living, and that boundary could be kind of problematized in a lot of ways and lead to a haunting of the living by the dead, still comes into play. Um, in all these novels and others, we get this quite common theme in sensational fiction of the dead being either reanimated by proxy. For instance, in The Woman in White, Laura Fairley uh, dies in the sense that she is replaced by a dead body, and that dead body, her half sister Anne, is kind of buried in her name, buried with her name. So, for all intents and purposes, as far as society is aware, Laura Fairley is dead because the corpse of Anne was used in her stead and put in the ground. Again, just as was the case with the Resurrection Man, this is a ploy to get at some money, money that is bound up in the legal status of whether or not someone was kind of walking the earth. And if you can depict Laura Fairley as a dead person, then this money becomes available to you. This is a very common theme in the sensational fiction of the period. So Laura Fairley, in reality, was changed to Anne Catherick and put in an institution, whereas Anne Catherick was given the name of Laura Fairley and put in the ground because she was actually dead. So this kind of switcheroo was another kind of way of resurrecting a dead body. Similarly, in Lady Audley's Secret, Lucy Graham's death is, she fakes it. In this case, the idea of faking a death is comes from the person whose identity is switched out. Whereas with The Woman in White, Laura Fairley is the victim of an imposed death, or the victim of an imposed change in identity. Lucy Graham, on the other hand, it's kind of, she is the villain in the story, in the novel. And it's her idea to fake her death, to assume a new identity, and to try to marry into money after her destitute husband left her. In both cases, there is this kind of haunting from beyond the grave. And in both cases, the prime motivator behind this faking of death is money. Okay, I want to talk a little bit now about the law with regard to sensation fiction. Some of this draws from Gothic theorist, literary theorist David Punter, who wrote quite extensively on the way in which Gothic literature often depicts the law as insufficient, that characters in the Gothic exist at the margins of the law. And it seems quite clear that of all the different characteristics that sensation fiction has kind of adopted from the Gothic, that this is one of them, and very clearly that the sensation fiction of mid-century evokes, while it evokes old houses and trapdoors and dungeons and creepy graveyards and stuff, one of the underlying senses you get in Collins and in Braddon is the degree to which the law is totally inadequate. And Collins especially has an almost mocking attitude towards the law. You get that in the character of the Count in Woman in White. He mocks Laura pretty severely. We'll look at that a little bit later, for kind of assuming that criminals get their just desserts or get punished right at the very beginning of Woman in White. Hartwright, the principal protagonist, talks about the machinery of the law and how it could be depended on to fathom every case of suspicion, but the law is still, in certain inevitable cases, the pre-engaged servant of the long purse. In other words, if you have financial resources, hire the best lawyers, bribe people, hire private investigators, and the story is left to be told for the first time in this place. As the judge might once have heard it, so the reader shall hear it now. No circumstances of importance from the beginning to the end of the disclosure shall be related on hearsay evidence. That is the case. You have this kind of narratival innovation where it's very polyvocal. You're coming from different subjective perspectives. You hear Hartwright's story and Holcomb's story and other characters all kind of chime in with their account, as would, as is depicted here, as if they were kind of witnesses to a crime, and they more or less were witnesses to a crime. But unlike in a court, these witnesses, these narrators aren't really subjected to cross-examination or whatever. So you have this kind of natural, people might have a natural suspicion that these people are not being completely honest. They are not subjected to the usual scrutiny that a witness at a court proceeding would be subjected to. Okay, I want to specifically look at the second epic, chapter 3, which is an extremely interesting scene. Goes on for some time. I actually want to read it, not just myself, but the whole class, if I could have volunteers. I want to kind of zoom in and put a narrow focus on this particular scene, because I think it really is very rich and highlights Collins's attitudes about the inability of the law to give us justice when people who have perfectly good and noble intentions are forced to commit crimes, and those who have bad intentions get away with crimes. Okay, so let me just start this out. All right, so the second epic, chapter 3, the morning was windy and cloudy, and the rapid alterations of shadow and sunlight over the waste of the lake made the view look doubly wild, weird, and gloomy. Some people call that picturesque. I call it a blot on a gentleman's property. In my great-grandfather's time, the lake flowed to this place. Now look at it. Look at it now. It is not 4 feet deep anywhere. What do you think, Fosco? It looks just the place for a murder, doesn't it? My good Percival, what is your solid English sense thinking of? The water is too shallow to hide the body, and there is sand everywhere to print off the murderer's footsteps. It is, upon the whole, the very worst place for a murder that I ever set my eyes on. Humbug! You know what I mean, the dreary scenery, the lonely situation. If you choose to understand me, you can. If you don't choose, I am not going to trouble myself to explain my meaning. Okay, so these two, Sir Percival and the Count, disagree on whether or not this lake is a good place to murder someone or to hide a body. What exactly, what's the difference in, one thinks it is and one thinks it isn't. Why did they think that? Why did they think their respective thoughts about the lake?
I think it really communicates like Sir Percival's like emotional approach to the world, and the Count's very logical. Like these are the facts of the case, as it were. Like these are the ways in which something could or could not be done. So much more logical.
Precisely. So Sir Percival is looking out over this gloomy lake, and it's weird and wild and gloomy and dark and menacing looking, and that is evoking in him this like, oh, that looks like a place you could really murder someone. The Count, you're right. On the other hand, the Count is like, what? You don't want to murder someone here. It's too shallow. You know, the body's going to stick out of the water, and there's sand on the shore, and you could see the footprints, and any inspector or policeman's going to see the footprints leading to the lake. It's the very worst place for a murder. So it's very kind of unsettling in the sense that the Count's actually thinking like, if I was really going to carry off a murder, how would I do it? So it reveals that he's got this scheming mind, and that's interesting because later he does come up with these criminal schemes. So he's looking at this thing as an actual prospect for a locale for murder. And the count continues, and why not when your meaning can be explained by anybody in 2 words? If a fool was going to commit a murder, your lake is the first place he would choose for it. If a wise man was going to commit a murder, your lake is the last place he would choose for it. Is that your meaning? If it is, there is your explanation for your ready-made. Take it, Percival, with your good Fosco's blessing.
I am sorry to hear the Lakeview connected with anything so horrible as the idea of murder. And if Count Fosco must divide murderers into classes, I think he has been very unfortunate in his choice of expressions. To describe them as fools only seems like treating them with an indulgence to which they have no claim. And to describe them as wise men sounds to me like a downright contradiction in terms. I have always heard that truly wise men are truly good men and have a horror of crime.
My dear lady, those are admirable sentiments, he says, kind of slightly facetiously. And I have seen them stated at the tops of copybooks. And now he speaks to his mouse. My pretty little smooth white rascal, here is a moral lesson for you. A truly wise mouse is a truly good mouse. Mention that, if you please, to your companions, and never gnaw at the bars of your cage again as long as you live. Okay, so let's pause here for a second. So Laura says, I have always heard that truly wise men are truly good men and have a horror of crime. And that seems like she's saying if you're wise enough to know better, you're not going to commit crimes. And then the Count counters this by saying that crime for a mouse who is in a cage is gnawing at the bars and trying to escape. That's the mouse equivalent to a crime. Is it not? Because if you're the owner of a pet mouse, you consider it trying to escape from its cage as a crime. So he's saying you need to, if you want to be good and wise, know your place and never commit crimes. But we as readers, we don't want to be a mouse in a cage, right? So there's something slightly unjust about putting a mouse in a cage. And justice in mouse's terms and wisdom in mouse's terms would be actually to gnaw through the cage and escape and be free. So it's really interesting because the Count is this diabolical asshole, and Laura is this sweet, perfectly good and innocent like protagonist that everyone loves, as we should. She's a good person. But Collins is kind of, again, troubling the whole issue of law by putting, sweet, kind of well-meaning sense in Laura's mouth that we, in one sense, all agree to implicitly. We think that if you're really wise, you're not going to go out and be a criminal. And yet, here is the Count justifying criminality. We as readers kind of think, yeah, in a way that's true. If you were a mouse in a cage, crime would be to bite through that cage, and you'd be justified in doing it. So it's, anyway. All right, go ahead, Laura.
It is easy to turn everything into ridicule, but you will not find it quite so easy, Count Fosco, to give me an instance of a wise man who has been a great criminal.
Most true. The fool's crime is the crime that is found out, and the wise man's crime is the crime that is not found out. If I could give you an instance, it would not be the instance of a wise man. Dear lady lied. Your sound English common sense has been too much for me. It is checkmate for me this time, Miss Halcombe. Ha.
Stand to your guns, Laura. Tell him next that crimes cause their own detection. There is another bit of copybook morality for you, Fosco. Crimes cause their own detection. What infernal humbug.
I believe it to be true.
Very good. Oops, hold on. Before we move on. So why do you think Sir Percival's laughing so hard here? Why might he be laughing? It's very suspicious. Did Sir Percival kind of get away with crimes in his past? In his past he did, and he hopes to get away in the future too. So This might be nervous. This might be nervous laughter. I don't know.
Mhm.
Okay. All right. Sorry, this is a long one. I'll just try to make it quick. Crimes cause their own detection, do they? And murder will out. Another moral epigram, will it? Ask coroners who sit at inquests in large towns if that is true, Lady Glyde. Ask secretaries of life assurance companies if that is true, Miss Halcombe. Read your own public journals. In the few cases that get into the newspapers, are there not instances of slain bodies found and no murderers ever discovered? Multiply the cases that are reported by the cases that are not reported, and the bodies that are found by the bodies that are not found. And what conclusion do you come to? This, that there are foolish criminals who are discovered and wise criminals who escape. The hiding of a crime or the detection of a crime, what is it? A trial of skill between the police on the one side and the individual on the other. When the criminal is a brutal, ignorant fool, the police in 9 cases out of 10 win. When the criminal is a resolute, educated, highly intelligent man, the police in 9 cases out of 10 lose. If the police win, you generally hear all about it. If the police lose, you generally hear nothing. And on this tottering foundation, you build up your comfortable moral maxim that crime causes its own detection. Yes, all the crime you know of. And what of the rest?
Devilish true and very well put.
Oh, sorry, we forgot to give people a Marion. Who's not reading? Lorraine?
I'll try my best. It's a little blurry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Are you? Okay.
It might be on my end.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Some of it may true and all of it may be very well put, but I don't see why Count Fosco should celebrate the victory of the criminal over society with so much exultation, or why you, Sir Percival, should applaud him and so loudly for doing it.
Very good, very good. Okay, so she has an interesting point. Like, this might be true, what you described, but you seem awfully happy that this is the case, that some wise, AKA intelligent criminals get away with their crimes. You almost seem to kind of relish the criminal who gets away with it. Okay, Sir Percival. Sir Percival.
Mhm. Do you hear that, Fosco? Take my advice and make your peace with your audience. Tell them virtue's a fine thing. They like that, I can promise you.
Okay, so this is the last little soliloquy here. Miss Halcombe is unanswerable, that is to say, so far as she goes. Yes, I agree with her. John Bull does abhor the crimes of John Chinaman. He is the quickest old gentleman at finding out the faults that are his neighbors, and the slowest old gentleman at finding out the faults that, let's say my internet connection is unstable. I don't know why. I'm sorry. I will continue. Finding out the faults that are his own, who exists on the face of creation. Is he so very much better in his way than people whom he condemns in their way? And this is where he gets to the point. English society, Miss Halcombe, is as often the accomplice as it is the enemy of crime. Yes, yes. Crime is in this country what crime is in other countries. A good friend to a man and to those about him as often as it is an enemy. A great rascal provides for his wife and family. All right, so he's just making the last point here, saying that basically that the scoundrel might end up in a prison, but a lot of honest people end up in a workhouse. You could say they get their just dessert by being imprisoned in the long run if they ended up getting caught. But an honest person will have kind of his own prison at the end of the day. Not always, but likely or often is the case, will end up in the workhouse if he's just an honest working person. Okay, I don't want to, so thank you for participating. Bravo. Okay, just to quickly kind of sum up this assessment of Woman in White's relation to the law. At the very end of the novel, Hartwright explains that his actions were vindicated precisely because of the inadequacies of the law. The law would never have obtained me my interview with Miss Catherick. In other words, his interview with Mrs. Catherick was illegal. And the law would never have made Pesca the means of forcing a confession from the Count. So he took extra legal means to achieve his end. And we as readers were kind of rooting for him the whole way. So once again, Collins puts the law under this kind of rubric of being insufficient for every case in which humans interact. And sometimes there are perfectly well-meaning humans who are kind of forced to break the law. And I think even Hartwright's name is a testament to this. You know, his name is Hartwright, like his heart is in the right place. Here's a person who breaks the law. We're rooting for him. He seems to have nothing but noble sentiments all the way through, but his heart's in the right place. His name's Hartwright. And yet even he is forced to break the law as he goes. I'll briefly mention these other two novels that Lady Audley's Secret that we will look at next week, and Wilkie Collins. I talked about Lady Audley's, or I talked about the Wilkie Collins a little bit, but Lady Audley's Secret also kind of takes in some of these same themes. The way in which the grave is brought in, the kind of resurrection, as it were, is brought in a kind of scheming way. Lady Audley, unlike the other heroines in these other novels, is kind of a villain of a sort. And she uses her own, she's kind of the mastermind of her own resurrection, as it were. And once again, it's an effort to kind of avoid poverty. So she might have had not noble motives, but understandable motives for a person of her rank in society, to want to kind of marry up, as it were. And if she has to fake her death, and she, you know, you could kind of, if you know all the details of Lady Audley's Secret, you kind of give her a little bit of rope, a little bit of slack, because as far as she knew, her husband kind of abandoned her. But only within reason. She did try to kill this ex-husband, or this husband, once he came back to her. Luckily for her, he actually didn't die. But for most of the novel, you think he's dead, and you suspect that she is the murderer. So it kind of has a slightly happy ending because the guy didn't die at the end. And I talked about No Name earlier. I already talked about it a little bit, but these three novels all have very interesting parallels with each other, and worth kind of going into kind of microscopic level sometimes, usually with really interesting results. So hopefully I did that a little bit of justice today. So thank you very much. Any questions?